Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, today I'm going to be Professor Ian Phillips for the course Education 101. This is the 7th lecture in the series on special education and case law. And so before we get started, I just want to say timestamps will be in the description below, so do feel free to refer back or skip forward and do so at your leisure. Now, we're going to get started with a brief review on stakeholder engagement and collaboration. And so don't go anywhere. If you want to skip forward, do so now. But we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about stakeholders. Who are these people, and why should I care one bit about engaging them in the educational process? And then we'll get to special education and some of these case laws. All right, so what is a stakeholder? A stakeholder is for any person at all, any person or entity who has a hand or a stake in a child's education. And now, why do I say entity? It's like, what do you mean? Who else could possibly have a stake in a child's education? It's like, well, in this country, the United States of America, corporations are treated the exact same as people are. In fact, they kind of have more protections than people do. And so, I'm saying entity or person. Now, what are some good examples of these? Well, teachers, parents, community members, other peers, staff members, and the like. And so anybody who has a role in a child's education, right? And then there could also be other things that are a little bit more conspicuous. So a person walking down the street who the child has never even saw before, right? And they're never going to see ever again, right? If that person just walks past them, right, it was a good interaction, right? But if the person walks past them and just punches them in the face and breaks their jaw, right, now all of a sudden it was a bad interaction. But you can see the influence that that person could potentially have on a child's education, right? They just negatively impacted a child's education, right? Because it's obviously clearly going to disrupt their educational experience, right? By the fact they got a broken jaw now. And, that person who chose to do that heinous action towards the student now has negatively impacted their education. And so, well, I think it only lends credence to the fact that it takes a village to raise a child. So everybody, all members of society have to be engaged. And they have to be engaged in a positive manner, working towards the same goals. And if we're not all working towards those same goals, well, then there can be some conflicts that arise and potential negative consequences for the student's education. And so, when I think of stakeholders here and why it's important, I try to think about just the law in general. People, and again, this is what we're going to talk about a little bit here, but it's not quite the same here. So when I think about stakeholders, I think about sociability, and sociability is the action of abiding by societal expectations. And when I say societal expectations, like there's going to be different groups in a society that have different expectations for members of those groups. But generally speaking, as a society, we've come to certain conclusions about how to act in the world, and those are our laws and regulations that we have in a society. And if you don't abide by those, then you can potentially face consequences in terms of the law, and that might result in a fine, or maybe that even results in jail or prison. And that's not where we want our students to end up. And certainly, as a society, if we're not doing all we can now to try to break down these bad habits or these antisocial tendencies, then that's where the kids are going to end up. And so, look, you can't save them all, but if you stand any chance, you have to engage everybody. And engaging these people can oftentimes come in the form of just simple communication, getting everybody on board to work towards these goals, or at least providing them with some resources to where they're even able to do so in the first place, or work towards a more positive community-like state for the school, and fostering an experience where the upbringing of the child is more, it's more positive, right? You have more people who care about them and their future and their education, and people are looking out for that child. But you think to yourself, it's like, okay, well, that does sound good and does make sense. I mean, if we're all working towards the same goals of social behavior, which is pro-social behavior, which is the law itself, and obviously want to foster those in our kids, it's like, what can we do then? It's like, well, we can look at the literature. And it's like, you want to be teaching kids as young as possible some good etiquette and some routine about how to interact with others. And that's mainly what education should be comprised of, really, until they hit about, I guess it's arbitrary in some regards, right? But as young as possible, certainly all the way up until kindergarten. Because look, by the time they get to kindergarten, it's oftentimes too late. And if they're not socialized, well, then you're going to have a bad time. And it's only going to lead to bigger and bigger problems as they progress in age and they have more autonomy to act out those antisocial tendencies, because they have more freedom to do as they wish. And with freedom comes more responsibility. And when there's a lack of responsibility, or even though they have the same responsibility, I should say, when there's a lack of caring about that responsibility, that's when some big problems can arise. And so as a stakeholder in a child's education, you got to think some of the most important time frames are between about 0 to 5 really, maybe 6, right, at the latest. And if you're not targeting these students in a very pro-social manner, teaching them etiquette, how to play, interact with people, giving them positive experiences and not negative ones, then it's not going to work out. And so that's one thing there. But also the heritability of personality is another thing, which is also going to be conflicting with student mindset and why should they care about school, and how hardworking should they be, and should they listen to the directions of teachers who maybe they don't agree with. So, well, what can you do about that? Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that personality is about 50% heritable at the age students are in school. And even worse than that, heritability of personality is about 80% by the time they get to their senior years. And it could be even more. And part of the reason is people have less social constraints on them. By the time they reach their senior years, nobody can tell them what to do. They have a little bit more freedom and autonomy over their being. And so heritability only rises as people earn more independence. And so they can truly act out whatever their personalities are on a genetic level. And you say to yourself, it's like, well, clearly an environment plays a role. And it's like, yes, an environment obviously plays a role in that. But how much does it really play a role? And if it does play the role of 50%, let's say, so 50% heritability, so you got the 50% from the environment, how much of that are you going to be able to impact as any individual teacher? And so you say to yourself, okay, well, how many teachers do they have over time? Or you could say to yourself, how long am I going to be with this student? And how memorable are my experiences going to be? And as a teacher, one of the things is that you're going to have to come to reckon with is you can't make as big of a difference as you want to. And there's some good reasons for that. I mean, you're not going to be with these students all the time every single day. You're only with them 180 days for 1 hour out of the day. And maybe you're with them more if you're a younger teacher, or maybe you're with them more than that if you're teaching multiple different subjects, or maybe you got them for a study hall or whatever. But either way, the amount of hours you're with them versus the amount of time that they've been alive, plus the control that you have over that environment, is very, very limited. And so when you add up all of these factors, right, the difference that you make is it's like a fraction of a percent, right? And so if you want to make any difference towards these kids' personalities to try to, foster some more pro-social tendencies, then you're going to have to engage everybody else over time, right? Because now you engage all the teachers over time, you engage the parents, you engage the community members, you engage other students in this process. Well, maybe you can make a difference then. And the line between pro-social and antisocial behavior, people can jump over it pretty quickly. And so all you need is to foster just a little bit more positive of a difference, and maybe you can make that good change moving forward in the child's life. And so stakeholder engagement is extremely important. We break down everything statistically in the last lecture, and so do feel free to refer back to that at any time. And with that said, we'll get started with the lecture here on special education and case law. Now, oh boy, like this lecture is going to get me in trouble maybe. I don't know. Special education is one of those topics that's extremely heated. Everybody has their own opinions of it. And again, it goes back to the whole issue of controversy with behavior management. Some people are going to have different beliefs than you, and if you can't learn how to interact with these people, oh God, you're going to have a very bad time. And if you can't learn how to respectfully disagree, you're going to have a bad time. And if you don't know the law yourself, and they do, you're going to have a really bad time, especially if you disagree, because they will eat you alive on special education and case law. And it's also, well, one thing I will say here is we'll just bust on into the first section here on importance, right? There are some serious consequences for not upholding special education law. And it's the most litigious law in all of education, the most litigious area in all of education, right, in general, right? And if you're not following it, you lose your license, you'll face legal ramifications, and if you don't face those legal ramifications, certainly your principal is going to face those legal ramifications. They're going to be the ones getting the school fined, and they're going to lose their license and get fired from their job, and you'll get fired too, so that's just obvious. And the parents, in some cases, may be even able to go after especially if you willfully neglect special education law, and they'll be able to have to go after your personal finances as well. And so the protections that you're afforded as a teacher are just nothing compared to what these special education laws are doing to protect these special education students. And so you have to know them. It's not optional. Even if you disagree with these special education laws, it's not optional, and it's not worth fighting in the least, because you will lose every single time, and there's absolutely no way around this. It's not something that you can just willfully pick and say, well, I want to do this one day and I don't want to do it the next day, or I agree with 90% of this, but that last 10% I don't agree with. And so it's not that you can't do that. You have to follow all 100%. And so there's no dispensing with anything. It's a legal document. Oftentimes these special education plans that we'll talk about, and if you are going to be one of those people who just doesn't want to follow it, then God, you're just in a world of hurt. And so even if you disagree with it, it's like, and there's valid critiques of these laws that we'll talk about now, but even if you disagree with it, that's irrelevant. You still have to follow them. And so, but that's with any law in society, right? I mean, just look at it this way. What about like the legalization of drugs, for example? It's like, well, if you think drugs should be legal, it's like, well, then you still can't do them because they're illegal. And it doesn't matter what you think. All that matters is what the law says. And so you can't go to a judge and say, well, I think it should be legal, and therefore I don't think I should face jail time or a fine. And the judge is going to look at you like, what, are you stupid? They're going to say, no, like you're in trouble. And now that you probably said that, you're going to probably be even in more trouble. And so it's just something that you have to follow, and there's no way around it. And so, yeah, you can lobby on your own accord and say what you want to maybe try to change some of these laws, but until these laws are changed, you have absolutely no recourse. And so, anyways, on to the first special education plan, known as the IEP. These help students meet the same standards, but via a different pathway with accommodations. And so when I say same standards, I mean the exact same standards, exact same expectations, the same ones. Right? They have to be proficient in the same standards for whatever course it is as every other student in the class. The only difference is that they're going to receive some specialized instruction. And so they're going to get some extra help, some extra services along the way to help them meet those same standards and expectations that other students would not typically get or wouldn't always have a right to get, is probably a better way to phrase it. And so imagine this. Let's say that you're a teacher and you're teaching a lesson via a book, and you're reading that book to the class, or with the class for that matter, and during the class you say you got 20 minutes to read independently. And you think, okay, well, it's a pretty standard little thing, right? And we're going to maybe have an assignment afterwards. Maybe that student who's an IEP has the ability to hear text to speech, and so maybe you can get them like a PDF online, get them like the audio version of that text, right? Because maybe it's written in their IEP, right, that they have to have that accommodation, and you can't fight that. And so even if you were going to do that with the whole class, that's fine, right? But the next time you weren't going to do it with the whole class, you got to do it for them too. And even if you got to go out of your way to do it, right? Because it's in their IEP, you got to provide them with these services, and so it can be a lot of work on behalf of the teacher to uphold an IEP, and a lot of work that sometimes you might find redundant, or things that you don't want to do, or things that are pointless for that matter, but it's irrelevant because you have to do them, right? Because these kids have an IEP, and you can't violate their rights because this is a legal document. It's not just a document that you could throw into the trash. And so accommodations could be a bunch of different things. Text-to-speech is a good one. Simplified directions. Seating is a common one, right? You sit students up really close to the board, or wherever they want, preferential seating, so they get to decide to do whatever they want. And there's a lot of good that comes from IEPs, because clearly they can receive some services that are going to help them out with their learning that they just otherwise wouldn't receive. And there's going to be intervention specialists who are going to work with these IEP students to help them meet those accommodations. But as a teacher, you're still expected to uphold these accommodations as well. So not just the intervention specialist, also as a teacher, you're also going to have to uphold these same accommodations or modifications to the child's curriculum for that matter. And so special education, IEP, this is the first plan of them all. Now, what are some critiques? What are some critiques of the IEP? There's a lot of critiques of the IEP. Nowadays, the legal ramifications are so huge for special education that nobody wants to deal with the IEP students' parents complaining that they got a bad grade in the class or that they are getting in trouble or punished, maybe that they're being discriminated against unfairly because they have a disability. And you can't maybe punish them the same way. It's like, well, it turns out that you can. You can fail IEP students. You can perfectly follow their IEP and fail them. You give them 0 in the class if they don't do anything, or they refuse services, right? Or you could, like they do some heinous thing, they cuss out a teacher. It's like, dude, they can still get suspended for that. Are you kidding me? They can face the same consequences as everybody else, but nobody wants to deal with it nowadays. Everybody wants to avoid the problem before it even becomes a problem. And so what they'll say to teachers is they'll really encourage teachers nowadays to pass these IEP students along and just give them good grades because, well, if you're following the IEP, then they think that that should somehow mean that they're going to meet those same they're going to meet the same expectations as everybody else. But the thing is like that's not always true. It's like you go to a school where you're doing all you can to help these students, and like the class average is still going to be way below proficient. And so like not everybody's going to meet proficient, and if that's the average is below proficient by a whole bunch of performance index points, it's like why should you expect the IEP student to so why should you expect them to get a proficient on that, right, when the class average is below proficient? I mean, that just wouldn't make any sense, right? I mean, there's no logic to that. And now you could say, well, of course you're striving for proficiency. And it's like nobody said that you weren't striving for that, but the idea that you're always going to hit that is like so out there to me, and it doesn't make any sense at all. But people are trying to protect themselves. They want to keep their jobs. They want you to keep your job. They don't want anybody to come back and harass you or potentially get the school in a lot of legal trouble or financial trouble for that matter, because there's a lot of fines and lawsuit settlements that could be associated with not following IEPs. And so one of the big things here is that you might have to do things that you don't necessarily expect to be doing as a teacher. And it's very unfortunate because you might be pressured in situations because it's very common at a lot of schools. I was just reading a Reddit thread the other day where people were complaining about this, at their schools they have people who are encouraging them to just pass students along. And so, that's one critique of the IEP. What's another critique, though? What about the students who are just given this preferential treatment, right? And over time, whether for good or bad, maybe it helps them master the standards, maybe it doesn't help them master the standards. And oftentimes, they can be helpful, but there's a lot of times where it's whatever, and the kid's not going to do the work anyways, and they're not going to meet these same standards anyways. And so you think to yourself, well, why should we be legally mandated to provide some of these services when it's a huge time commitment on behalf of the teacher and a huge resource strain on behalf of the school? Why should we have these at all? And if we are going to have these, are they preparing them for the real world? Because that should be one of the goals of education, preparing students for the real world, where they go into the job market and they can function as employees and hopefully, or business owners, and hopefully, hold down a nice stable job and have a good income, and they can raise their family with whatever money that they're earning. And if you're on IEP, you're going to get certain accommodations your whole life, right? The earlier the better, but not always. You always get an early IEP. Sometimes IEPs come a little later. But let's say, you get an IEP in like 3rd grade. So for 9 years, right, you're going to have these special accommodations. But when you go to the workforce, you're not getting anything, right? Like you think you just, okay, well, you say, well, there's extra time on tests, for example, is like one of your accommodations. It's like you get double the amount of time. And it's like maybe that helps you out, maybe that doesn't. But let's say it helps you out, and that's a good thing, right? Maybe it was a good accommodation. It was a nice IEP. The student really needed one, and they can master the same. They can show proof of mastery for a particular topic via this test, but they just need twice the time because maybe they got like a reading difficulty, maybe they got dyslexia, for example. You could say to yourself, well, that's awesome, right? But now you go to the real world, you go to your boss and you say, well, hey, look, I'm going to need twice the amount of time to do my work, whatever it may be. Maybe you're at like McDonald's, for example, and say, I need twice the amount of time to make these cheeseburgers as everybody else. Right? They're going to look at you like, what are you, insane? Like, I'm not giving you twice the amount of time to do the same job as everybody else. It's like either get with the program or you're fired. I'm not risking my business and my thousands of dollars and millions of dollars, right, to watch you waste time on my dime. Right? That's just not going to happen. And so sometimes these IEPs are not preparing students for the real world. And like, yes, there's protections to help people with disabilities, but those protections do not extend that far in the workforce in comparison to the education system. And so some things that you're going to find in the education system, they're just not always going to translate over. And so you can think about accessibility is probably something that's a lot more common, whereas things to make accommodations for the actual job itself, I mean, those just, they sparingly exist. And so do take that into consideration. It's a valid critique of the IEP. And maybe not every single student should be getting an IEP. Personally, for me, I don't think most students should have an IEP. I think that the way it works is like we have a test, and I'm going to make things as individualized as I can for everybody. And I don't necessarily think that a legal document needs to tell me to do that. And if we are going to have legal documents, I want to have some more protections on my behalf, because maybe if I disagree with something, I want to be able to voice that. I want to have some recourse to say, look, this student doesn't really need that, or they're not benefiting from it. They're not X, Y, or Z, and because it's a big time commitment, right? But you have to follow it no matter what you think. And so, but that's just some critiques of it. It's not, it can land you in a world of trouble even saying some of these things, right? You don't want to be one of those people who always wants to be negative about the IEPs, but I've seen situations where you want to do all you can to protect yourself, and if you don't, people can come at you like piranhas. And so it's in your best interest to understand that these accommodations, you got to uphold them, but they might not always be for the benefit of the student. Even if it's in the interest of the student, so you're thinking about the student in mind, clearly, right? Because you want them to be the best. It's like, is it a good use of resources for the school? Right, so if you're an intervention specialist and you're these people doing these diagnostic screenings for these individualized education plan, like, is it really worth it that a student should receive that? Like, what if a student just has like a what if, and part of the reason I say this is because there's going to be a law that conflicts with this, right? And it's known as the Least Restrictive Environment, and we'll talk about that here. Let's talk about it right now. Least Restrictive Environment. So we'll skip the 504 plan for a second here. So what is the Least Restrictive Environment? The LRE. Removing kids from the general education classroom must be justified by their disability needs. And so you say to yourself, well, should they be getting all these accommodations and staying in the general classroom? It's like, well, the answer most oftentimes is going to be no. But people will throw them in the general classroom. Why? Because it saves money. You don't have to hire another teacher for a special education classroom or a resource room, or in some cases a behavior room. And so, these least restrictive environments, right? I mean, it's good in theory, but in practice, it's completely fallen apart these days. And in 2023, I don't see why people even still support why people still support it almost at all, right? Because you see a lot of the times what happens is schools, they don't want to spend the money. And so what they'll do is, instead of throwing kids into a resource room, which is where they should be, they try to provide them with more accommodations, which are ineffective. And so if you disagree with them, you still have to follow them, right? But they might be completely ineffective because the student really needs more personalized instruction. Like, look, man, if you got an IQ of like 55 and you're in the general classroom and I'm trying to teach you about like I don't know, 8th grade math or something, it's like you're never going to understand it, right? And so why am I hate to say it, wasting my time teaching that when you're just never going to understand it, right? Because it's a disservice to the kid. And if you think it's not, well, then you just don't know what you're talking about. Because like with an IQ of 55, it's like you should be having your own resource room with the individualized instructor trying their absolute hardest to teach you some of the more fundamental components of mathematics. Because if you just get passed along in the general classroom because you think, well, maybe it's good for you socially or emotionally or whatever you think it is, then it's going to be very rough on the student in terms of their actual tangible skills that they're going to bring with them to the job market, because they can't get any, right? Because their IEPs, like, you can only do so much, right? If you got 5 IEPs in the classroom, you can't be with them all at once. Like, you can try, but they're going to be different stages and different ability levels, and they're going to have different accommodations. And so you can do everything that you possibly can, but they're going to need more personalized instruction. So the least restrictive environment makes sense in some situations where you can keep them in the general classroom, and they can meet those same standards. But when the IEP is falling short and the accommodations are not working, you probably need to look to more individualized room for more individualized instruction. And people don't want to hear that nowadays. And so least restrictive environment must be justified by their disability needs. You can't just send a student with an IEP to a resource room, and nor should you. You shouldn't do that, right? You should send them to a resource room because they actually need to be there. But if you're in a situation where you can't get students in the resource room, then it seems to be a disservice to me to provide them with all these IEP accommodations, because time is valuable on behalf of the teacher. And it's like, if you got to take time to provide all these different accommodations, you're not making as good of lessons. And you're helping out a few to sacrifice the learning of the many. And that can be fine to some degree, right? But when it gets too extreme, then that's where you have some problems arise. And so I'm just thinking these out, just logically speaking, right? But special education in general, it is turned into one of those things that is just so controversial, it's just so, like, the vitriol that people have for it is just, it's off the charts, right? So, I think that it's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing in the same breath, right? There's positive and negatives to it both. And so, that's just a little discussion here on the IEP. And so next up here, we have the 504 plan. So like an IEP, 504s also provide accommodations, but based off of non-intellectual disabilities. And these pertains not to specialized instruction, but rather access to education. And so, for example, an IQ 54 versus serious asthma, right? The IQ 54 might get an individualized education plan, whereas the serious asthma case might still be in the general classroom, or may not need any specialized instruction, right, on behalf of the teacher in the class, right? But they might need to be able to take a break, right, or go outside and use their inhaler, or pull it out in class, or do whatever they need, or go to get a drink of water. And so that would be like the 504 plan. So you're providing them equal access to education. So they still have the access. They just got more ability to function freely in accordance with their needs under the 504 plan. Whereas the IEP will try to do that, but it's more like intellectual. For an IEP, it's really like you got some intellectual disability. We're going to try to help you out with this plan, and provide you some accommodations for that. The 504 is like, look, you got a disability that's hampering you from being in the general classroom or whatever classroom. Then you're going to, it's not going to give you specialized instruction. Like, I'm not going to sit there and read the test to you, for example. But I will allow you to maybe get up, take a break, or do something on those lines. And so 504 is a little different. But still, nonetheless, you got to provide accommodations. It's mandatory by law. There's absolutely no way around it. And so, IEP, 504 plans, least restrictive environment. We talked about all three of these things already. So now, where do these things come from? Well, IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is going to outline all of the laws associated with IEPs. Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is going to outline all of the laws that 504 plans are derived from. And so very, very big laws here that are going to outline everything that you got to do, that has to do with special education, more or less. Now, there's going to be some other aspects too that we'll talk about here. Some things that are a little bit newer, some things that are a little bit, in general, even more controversial too, I could argue. So, all right, next up here, response to intervention, RTI. Oh boy, I really do despise this whole concept in education, RTI. It's actually probably the thing that sparks the most vitriol in my veins. Every single time I hear RTI, response to intervention, I just immediately get so angry because it's the most stupidest, useless practice, actually harmful, neglectful practice in all of education that should be banned nationwide. Right, if I were president today, I'd sign an executive order outlawing response to intervention being used in any school across the country or all territories of the United States of America. This is a cancerous practice that has somehow been perpetuated by educators for the longest time now, and I will break down why it is the most useless thing in the world, but you still have to follow it, right? It's neglectful, it's evil, it's a horrible practice that, quite frankly, doesn't even make sense on its surface here. This pyramid, for example, we'll talk about, as you can see this here, look, it says percentage of students, 80 to 90% in the green, 5 to 10% in the yellow, 1 to 5% in the red. It's like, it doesn't even look the same for every school, right? So the fact that it's even like a thing is so stupid because it's not even taking into account individual student demographics. But, besides that, we'll get to it here. So response intervention, what is it? Is it a practice that you should be using as a teacher? Well, response intervention is the idea that you can provide different levels of interventions for certain students, target students. And these different levels of intervention will help foster pro-social behavior as well as academic growth for that student, academic attainment in terms of proficiency level. And so ideally, tier 1 would be the interventions that every single student in all settings is going to receive. And so the majority of the students are going to respond well to these universal interventions, these tier 1 interventions. And so that's why they're in the green. They represent the majority of the pyramid. Right? Then the idea is that you have a target group here for some students who are at risk, right? And those people are in the yellow. And so you're going to provide more specialized, more unique, rapid data-driven response interventions for those students in the yellow, right? Because if they're not responding to the interventions in the green, you're going to try to make things more personalized, go the yellow. And then really, if they're not responding to that, then you get to things that are a little bit more serious. And that's going to be in the red. And so very individualized, personalized interventions, very intensive, longer duration, and again, assessment-based. So you're using a little bit more data as well. So minimal data in the yellow, if any, but then a lot more heavy on data in the red, like very, very heavy. And so you think to yourself, well, that sounds good, right? And it's like, yeah, that does sound good. But the idea of RTI is this, right? This is the primary message, right? Let's say, hypothetically speaking, you have a student and they're not responding to the universal interventions underneath tier 1. And so you move them up to tier 2 and they're still not responding. So you move them to tier 3 and all of a sudden, wow, you got this, they got all these individualized interventions, right? And it's intense, right? It's over a very long period of time and there's a lot of data associated with it and they're in that red column, right? Well, if they respond to it and you start to see some growth, well, then you just do away with the RTI process. So they respond well in the red, and they're on track to have some good pro-social behavior. They're on track to perform at proficiency level for academics. And then all of a sudden you pull all of these interventions beneath the student, right? So now they have nothing again. They're just back at the universal interventions level, and they start to crumble. That's like, what is that evidence of? I think that's evidence that they need an individualized education plan. Oh, but wait, no, we can't do that, right? Because we went through the RTI process, and so it's completely useless. And so the only time they get an IEP, most oftentimes is when all these interventions are failing besides, and all of these interventions are failing at all levels, right? Then we can start talking about IEP. It's like, that's just so stupid. Like, it's like if you finally identified a student who needs the individualized instruction, they need an individualized care, and maybe they're responding well to it at the highest echelons of this little pyramid here, and then all of a sudden you pull those away from them and say that they don't need an IEP, it makes no sense whatsoever. And the fact that this is even being perpetuated is honestly sickening because you're essentially just neglecting the needs of people who have disabilities and the needs of students who have these disabilities and need this more intensive care. In some cases, maybe the ones in the very top of the pyramid get an IEP, and so it's like it's not everybody, right? But in a lot of situations, it will just be pulled from underneath them. And the idea is that you get them back on track, right? They're at risk, and you can hopefully prevent this poor performance moving forward. But it doesn't last, and it never will last because they need these long-lasting interventions. And so you can't just do them for a period of time and they go away. It's like and then also too, it's like, all right, so these things take time, right? This doesn't happen overnight. If you move a student to tier 2, they're now in a targeted group and they're still not responding to it, right? Oh, well then, we waited a couple months. All right, let's go to tier 3 now. And we'll wait even longer, right, for the student to see if they adapt to these practices, right? So that's like, like, excuse me? So what you're basically doing is you're saying, yeah, I don't want to spend 5 hours with the student to diagnostic screen them for an IEP. Instead, I'm going to spend multiple months neglecting their individualized needs, and maybe they get help, maybe they don't, and maybe they get an IEP, maybe they don't. And so it's like, why on earth are we even promoting this? And like the reason for it is because, yeah, it's a lot of work on behalf of diagnostic testers for these IEP plans and people who need additional services. And so schools don't want to deal with it, right? They'd rather just put it to the wayside, right? Because it can be a lot on intervention specialists. And the more that you have, who need an IEP, the more intervention specialists you're going to have to hire. And that's more money that you have to spend. And so you're only given so much money, and anything else is going to be a drain. And then, the people at the top, they don't want to hear that. And so, the superintendent's going to look at you like, why are you spending so much money? And the principal's going to be like, maybe like a deer in the headlights. And so, you have to think about this when people are implementing these practices, because it's not always for the benefit of the student. It can be very political in some regards, right? These things essentially push back the inevitable. And it's very sad, right? Because there'll be situations where students always don't get what they actually need to. So response to intervention, RTI, again, it's one of those things that I feel like it's one of those things where people know what needs to be done for a student, but it's like a temporary solution to a permanent problem, right? And sometimes maybe it's not permanent, right? That's not always the case in every situation, but a lot of times it is. And so most of the times the RTI process completely fails. And, or it's just not, or it's a delay for something that should have happened earlier. And so it's neglectful in that regard. Anyways, response to intervention, you're going to have to use it. There's no way around it. Get used to it. I don't like the practice, but people love it, and I don't get it. Actually, people don't like this process. Everybody I talk to hates it, but anyways, that's besides the point. Anyways, we got a functional behavior assessment, or an FBA. This is most often used in special education as a means to identify the cause of a behavior, or an FBA, functional behavior assessment. So if you have a student who's acting all difficult, they're acting nuts, they're misbehaving all the time, exhibiting antisocial behavior, conduct disorder, antisocial tendencies, the like, breaking every rule and expectation you possibly have, right? You might do something such as a cause of this behavior. And most oftentimes this is only used in special education, but general classroom teachers can do this as well, and I encourage them to do so. You can try to get to the root of that behavior. What's causing that, right? And if you know the manifestation of that behavior, then maybe you can help remediate it. But if you don't know the cause and you don't know the source of it, it's like, well, then good luck, right? Like, if you don't know the source of the fire, how are you going to extinguish it, right? And so if you know the source, maybe you can try to tackle it a little bit better. And you're not going to have all the resources to always tackle the issue, but at least you know more of what you're dealing with. You can try to tackle it to the best of your ability. Whereas you're trying to be more proactive as opposed to reactive with the functional behavior assessment here. All right, so actually also too, I want to cover one more thing here. I didn't mention it here. Let's say, so I mentioned individualized education plans are very controversial, right? Not everybody agrees with them. Some people do agree with them, but whether or not you agree with them is irrelevant because you have to uphold them. But let's say you have a situation where people don't want to punish the students for their misbehavior because they have an IEP, which is extremely common. And if you think it's not common, that just means you haven't been in education long enough, or you're at a very school that just for some reason doesn't believe that, and so which is just probably a good thing. And so anyways, individualized education plan, they have something called a manifestation determination, and I should have put it down here. But a manifestation determination is essentially a hearing if a student commits some disciplinary infraction. And the hearing is designed to say, well, was that behavior a manifestation of their disability? And if it wasn't, well, then you provide them some consequence. But if it was, okay, well, then we go on to step 2. Was that manifestation of their disability, and were you failing to uphold their accommodations, which caused them to manifest that behavior? And if that's the case, then you really can't do anything. But if it is the case, then that you were upholding everything and it was a manifestation of the disability, then all that really means, I believe, is that you have to provide them services still at home or whatever, if they have like out of school suspension or in school suspension for that matter. And so manifestation determinations are a way for special education students to be treated the same as everybody else, right? But you got to go through some additional steps, right? It's like an added protection to make sure that it wasn't just their disability and that you're punishing them for just, you know, being disabled in some regard. It's actually just their behavior in general, which is causing them to act in a certain way. And so either way, they can still face some consequences, but you got to make sure you're upholding your IEP. And if you're not, then that's when you run into some serious problems. And you should, because you should be upholding the IEP. It's a legal document again. It's designed to help the student. And so anyways, response to intervention, RTI. We already covered that. FBA covered that. All right, next up here. No Child Left Behind versus the Every Student Succeeds Act. These are the two federal laws which are governing over the entire United States. One is the old law, which I think it was repealed back in 2015 and replaced by ESSA in 2015. All right, so No Child Left Behind was until like 2015 or so, and then Every Student Succeeds Act has been from that point onwards. And so ESSA is the new federal law that we have today. But you're always going to hear people mention No Child Left Behind. When I was growing up, and people who were probably listening to this lecture, No Child Left Behind was the law of the land. And No Child Left Behind is one of those things that people mention all the time, even if they have no idea what it actually did. And they're going to critique it because it sounds as if it's just constantly passing students grade to grade. No child is left behind. Oh, so therefore no child can be held back. It's like, no, that's not what it means, right? No Child Left Behind is different than that, although I can see how people come up with that conclusion because that is a trend in education where nowadays kids can't be held back. And again, it gets tied right back into what we were talking about earlier. So a lot of times people don't want to deal with it and the ramifications of holding people back, especially like IEP students. Like they'll almost never get held back. And like you can do it, but it's murky waters. And so you got to make sure you're on top of things, dotting every I, crossing every T. And so anyways, No Child Left Behind. What are some of the grand points of No Child Left Behind Act? It's going to state that states have less power over their goals. And universal goals for all students to be proficient in math and reading. There's going to be no limit on the percent of students who could use alternative tests. And so that would be like special education students. Only looked at math and ELA test scores to see how schools were doing. And there's something called adequate yearly progress goals, which must have been met in order to not be punished by Title I funding allocation. And so essentially No Child Left Behind foster this system of mediocrity. Right? And I think that's what people call in the literature, you're fostering mediocrity, right? A system of perpetuating mediocrity, where you have these states and they have less power over their goals. The federal government's going to set certain proficiency expectations for reading and math. And you also are going to set a progress goal for your own school. And if you don't meet that progress goal, then you lose funding. And not only do you lose funding as a school by Title I funding allocations, you're also going to have a bunch of people get fired. And the state might even step in. Or the federal government's going to tell the state that they got to step in. And so it can be it was very crazy, No Child Left Behind Act. I wasn't teaching when it was around, but the No Child Left Behind Act was fostering the system where schools were like, well, screw that, I'm not losing my funding. And so they'll just set low, extremely low adequate yearly progress goals, AYP goals, and avoid that problem in general. And so instead of always striving for the best, they strove for mediocrity. And instead of striving to be proficient in all subjects, they only strove to be proficient in math and reading. So all of their resources went into math and reading, and social studies and science got pushed to the wayside. And now, I think social studies and science are the most important subjects, but I'm a little biased here because I was a science teacher and now I'm a social studies teacher, and so got pushed to the wayside. But having said that, math and reading scores would have went up, the other ones went down. And so, well, who really won there? They're not getting as well-rounded of an education as they otherwise maybe could have. because all the resources are only going to certain things. So anyways, that's No Child Left Behind Act. Well, how does the Every Student Succeeds Act differ? Well, states have power to set their own goals now, and only 1% of students can receive an alternate test. And many factors are looked at to see how schools are doing. And stakeholder engagement is taken more seriously concerning the creation of state plans. And so let's get into some of the differences here. So nowadays, under ESSA, the required academic factors must be reading math test scores, English language proficiency test scores, high school graduation rates, a state-chosen academic measure for grade schools and middle schools. And then there's also a school quality factor. So you can choose another factor as well. So like kindergarten readiness, access to and completion of advanced coursework, college readiness, school climate and safety, chronic absenteeism, and schools are going to get more weight for the academic factors than the school quality factors. And so that's what they're rated on, as opposed to just the proficiency of reading and math scores. And so it's a little bit different here. So anyways, that is the Every Student Succeeds Act versus the No Child Left Behind Act. ESSA is what we have today. So this is the law of the land nowadays. And ESSA oftentimes too comes with schools picking more unique curriculum, which was a little bit more barred under No Child Left Behind Act, even though schools could. But nowadays, like everybody uses what's called Common Core curriculum, and that's like used in like 46 states or something crazy like that, 45 states. And reading and math are the main Common Core standards that are used for states, and they're gonna differ slightly between states, right? But they're only differing by like a couple words. And so what's one standard in one state is still the same as another standard in another state, even if it's just slightly different, word or two. But Common Core is pretty much the law of the land nowadays in terms of curriculum. And that really came into play when ESSA was put into motion. So anyways, that's enough for some of our bigger laws here. Now we're getting into some case law, some of the less important things you have to know. But you should know them, right? You should know case laws. You should know what your rights are, what some of the rights of your students are. You'll sound smarter in conversation. And you'll know what you can and can't do to some degree, even if these things aren't as fleshed out, right? Because a lot of these laws were, 40, 50 years ago. And so, maybe they don't seem as relevant as they once were, and they're not as relevant as they once were, because there's been other case laws on top of those, which is only solidifying or reinforcing these laws here, and fleshing them out a little bit more, providing more structure to them about what they can and what they do mean and what they don't mean. And so we do have a bunch of important case laws here, and we'll cover all of these, and then we'll also get to an IEP Accommodations Log at the end here, and so we'll do that in our conclusion. Anyways, some important case laws. So the first one that we're going to talk about here is Richard v. Thurston. And Richard v. Thurston was in 1970, so about 53 years ago, and ruled that students had the right to have long hair in general and facial hair, and that compelled conformity is not enough to dispel with a student's constitutional right underneath the 14th Amendment to wear their hair how they see fit, simply as a matter of individual taste. And so the crux of the issue here is that students have a right to individual expression as long as it doesn't interrupt the educational process. And so a student can have whatever hair they want, and as long as it's not disrupting the whole class severely, significantly disrupting the class, well then you're allowed to have it, and nobody can tell you otherwise as a student. And so Richard v. Thurston. Next up, perhaps the biggest law in all of education you're going to hear about nowadays is Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969, and the one below it's even bigger, but Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969, the Supreme Court ruled that school officials cannot prohibit speech only on the suspicion that speech might disrupt the learning process. And students were wearing black armbands in protest of the war in Vietnam, and the court found that armbands were basically pure speech. And so how a student dresses, right, and or just speech in general cannot be disrupted, right? It cannot be prohibited based on the potential for it to disrupt the learning environment. It actually has to disrupt the learning environment. There actually has to be some big disruption. Right? And it can't just be the teacher freaking out, right? And nobody else even cares one bit. Like, that could be the case, right? But most of the time, that's not going to be the case. And so the school can't just prohibit speech because they think it might disrupt the learning process on behalf of students, right? That's just not possible. So if a student wants to wear something, they're allowed to do so. They're allowed to do so. Next up, Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. This is going to rule that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, even if segregated schools were of the same quality, since it violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. So ending of segregation in schools. And, you know, we're also going to have a lot of programs come forth in years following Brown v. Board of Education where there's going to be busing. And so that would bus students from one part of town to the other, even if it was a school less close to their home, in order to foster a more diverse student demographics in schools. And so that's going to be a big push in years post Brown v. Board of Education. Next up, Pickering v. Board of Education. This one's important for teachers to know. A teacher has the right to speak on political issues as long as they do not, 1, breach confidentiality or undermine the superior-subordinate relationship. And so there's confidential information, like an IEP, for example. You can never say what a student has underneath an IEP. Like, you just can't do that, right? Like, that's illegal. Or undermine the superior-subordinate relationship. And then 2, interfere with their job performance or school operations. So you don't want to have speech that's going to interfere with your work or the school operations, right? But if it's speech that's not interfering, then it's no biggie. And then 3, include reckless or knowingly false statements. Include reckless or knowingly false statements. So you can't just go out and libel somebody or slander somebody. That's obviously illegal, right? But it also is reckless statements as well. And so, while reckless can be defined in many different ways, I am under the firm belief that teachers should be allowed to say whatever they want, whenever they want. I think reckless speech should be encouraged, right? I mean, it's illegal. Look, you should be protected, freedom of speech, right? It's nobody's business besides your own. If it's not impacting your work, who cares? And that's essentially what this law is saying. But reckless, that does disrupt the educational process, is where you're going to face some, you could potentially face some consequences. And so reckless or knowingly false statements. And so yes, Pickering v. Board. Right? Don't disrupt the education process as a teacher, right? And so you argue, you say, well, maybe it does disrupt, maybe it doesn't disrupt, maybe it's subjective, and it is subjective, and it's clear that it's subjective. But these things are, you want to tread cautiously. And even if you're in the right in terms of your speech to say things, sometimes you might not want to say them at all because they can bite you. And you want to be the most protected that you possibly can be, even if that means you're going to face some, you're going to be annoyed by doing it. And so anyways, just watch what you're saying. Try not to say anything too crazy. Even if you could get away with it legally, you don't want to deal with that. It's too big of a problem, and I wouldn't recommend it. But you can, and so do as you see fit. Anyways, Goss v. Lopez, 1975, concluded that public schools must conduct a hearing before subjecting a student to suspension. So they actually have to go over what the student's being charged with, pretty much. It's a due process thing, with Goss v. Lopez. Failure to provide a hearing violates the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. And so there's that, Goss v. Lopez. Next up, we got Hazelwood School District v. Kohlmeyer, 1988. The Supreme Court ruled that schools may restrict what is published in student newspapers if the papers have not been established as a public forum. And so they can restrict student newspapers if it's not a public forum. Leyshock, and that would be like the same for social media and stuff like that too nowadays. So like any media in general that students are using, as long as it's school sponsored. If it's not school sponsored, well, they can pretty much do whatever they want. But if it is school sponsored, Hazelwood School District v. Kohlmeyer on 1988 is going to come into play. Next up, we got Leyshock v. Hermitage School District, 2011. The court ruled that schools cannot punish students for tasteless, offensive, off-campus web posts that are not disruptive to the learning environment. A fake social media of the school principal was made in this case, right? So they can, say some fake things or obscene things that are offensive and annoying. And as long as they're not disruptive to the learning environment, well, then they can do whatever they want. Next up, we got JS v. Blue Mountain School District, 2011. A third U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that a student JS could not be punished at school for a MySpace parody of a school principal created off school grounds, as it did not create a significant disruption at school. And so what, maybe they, like the school principal finds it annoying, right? But they, nobody else does. It's like, well, look, they're protected via JS v. Blue Mountain in 2011. And so, these things are, it can be annoying at times if you're an official yourself and you want to, get punished for something that you deem as disruptive. But even if it's their own personal speech, what they say outside of school, that's on them, even if it's impacting you as an individual. And then you say to yourself, okay, well, I'll just take them to court, not on behalf of the school, and try to see if there's any legal ramifications there. It's like, well, it's even more tricky. So there's another law called New York Times v. Sullivan, 1964. To libel a public figure, there must be actual malice, thus restricting the ability of public officials to sue for defamation. Now, are principals always considered public figures? No. Are teachers always considered public officials? No. Now, it depends. Public figures? No. Now, it depends. In some states, teachers are considered public figures. But in other states, they're not. And so it really depends on your states. You got to know your state's laws. But you might not even be able to have any recourse in any capacity if you're a teacher and somebody's like parodying you or trying to be evil towards you, and because a parody could be evil, right? It really does depend on the situation, and so your protections are very limited when it comes to speech in terms of fighting back against their free speech. But that's a good thing that it protects their free speech, but it's also difficult as well in the sense that students could essentially say whatever they want about you online if you're like a teacher or an administrator, and even if it's offensive and whatnot, you really can't do anything about it. Like they could say, like, I hate them, they're blank beep, 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 and you can't do anything about it. And so, well, that can be annoying at times, right? But that's their freedom of speech, and so we don't tread upon freedom of speech because that's like the one best thing that we're possibly doing here in the US. It's a really good thing. We don't want to dispense with that. And so it's a good thing, but it can also be very bad in some regards, right? Because if it gets libelous or there's some slander involved, then that's obviously when there's a problem. Anyways, we got another law here, Wisconsin v. Yoder, 1972. This ruled that Amish parents' right to freedom of religion was determined to outweigh the state's interest in educating their children. So Amish children do not fall under compulsory education laws past grade 8. I've always thought, this law was insane. I always thought it's an evil law, right? So like if a parent, so first of all, the kid can't make their own decision, right? Because they're a child, right? And so that's the first thing that we have to establish here. But the parent could say, who, by the way, doesn't have any licenses or education at all, can say, the proper education to teach these students under a license in a particular state, can say, well, I don't think that my kid needs education anymore, and I'm just going to claim my religious right. It's like, well, now you're disrupting the child's education because you have some religious gripe with it. It's like that isn't crazy to me. But look, they're right, I guess. Wisconsin v. Yoder, 1972. They don't fall under compulsory education laws past the 8th grade. Now, I think it should be compulsory all the way to 12th grade, but look, I guess it's what it is. You really can't do anything about that. And it's unfortunate because, there could be a situation where the student wants that education, but the parents don't want them to have that education. Well, then, look, they don't have to send them to school. And, that's kind of like the same thing with homeschooling in some regards, right? Where, it's the same thing. But homeschooling law is just as crazy, right? Like parents can essentially do whatever they want. And this is going to tie in with that homeschooling law as well. And so it's like a free-for-all. There's like nothing regulating it in the least, right? And so especially, like in some states, like Ohio, for example, which is where I'm from, like homeschooling law is insane. Like there's literally no law about it. Like you could just have a kid homeschooled, give them a 4.0, never have them do any work ever again. It's like, it's crazy, right? Now, would they pass the state test? It's like, well, that's a totally different question. But, maybe they don't do anything and they still somehow pass and get a diploma. Or they don't do anything and they don't pass. And so there's like no regulations to it. It's just crazy. But I don't like this law because it's barring children from education when they don't necessarily know what's best. And so these are unlicensed individuals making these decisions. And it doesn't have to even be Amish, too. It could be anybody, right, making these decisions for religious reasons. And the kids certainly can't make their own decisions for them about their own education. And so, I just thought it was always crazy. Anyways, Equal Access Act 1984. This is going to prohibit public schools from receiving federal funds if they deny students the First Amendment right to conduct meetings because of religious, political, philosophical, or other content of speech at such meetings. And so, wow. So if schools, public schools cannot receive any federal funding if they're going to deny the First Amendment right to conduct meetings for any ideological reason at all. And so obviously schools don't want to lose the federal funding, but that's one thing. Equal Access Act 1984. And then lastly here, this is an interesting one. Bethel School District v. Frazier, 1986. This is going to give public school officials the authority to suspend students for speech considered to be lewd, vulgar, or plainly offensive, and particularly help to limit certain styles of expression that are sexually vulgar. And so, students can't say anything for speech that's lewd, vulgar, or plainly offensive. They can be suspended for it or face consequences for it. And that's Bethel School v. Frazier. Now, the distinction here between this and like, JS v. Blue Mountain or Layshock v. Hermitage is that this is on-campus speech versus off-campus speech. And so Bethel School District v. Frazier is like student speech on school grounds, right, or a school function, whereas the other ones are at home in their private time, on their private property, or whoever's property, right, not the schools. And so, well, you're going to have the authority to do that, to be lewd, vulgar, or plainly offensive. So like if they're swearing at a teacher, it could get a suspension. If they're swearing at other students, they could get a suspension or whatever, right? And it couldn't even be a suspension. It could be anything else, right? But suspension is what was in this case. And so Bethel School District v. Frazier. So students can be punished for that, which is now another thing nowadays. People don't even want to get into it. They don't even want to deal with kids swearing. It's like, look, there's a time and a place. It's like, I'm sure we all swear, but you don't do it when you're at school trying to learn. I mean, there's a time and place for things. Anyways, Education 101, that's special education and case law. Before we leave though, one thing I did want to show you guys was an IEP accommodation law, right? So how do you make sure that you're following IEP practices, trying to protect yourself as much as you possibly can? And well, how you do this here is you make an IEP accommodations log. And so you have some accommodations that the student's going to have, right? You write the name of the student here, write your name here for the month of blank, right? So let's say March, for example, right? And you got accommodations dates. So this would be like March 1st, and then you go over here March 6th, go over here March 25th, right? And then you just go down. You can initial each box whenever something was, an accommodation was provided. So simplified directions / restated, right? Preferential seating / close to the board, visual aids, verbal visual cues, right? Oral answers and scribe, small group assessments, right? Extended time, frequent breaks, peer-to-peer assistance. Modifications, you can have shortened assignments, limited answer choices, reduced number of questions on test. And so like these things, whenever you're providing them, you initial them. And so, that's going to help you protect yourself as a teacher, as well as, protect students' rights in some regards, because, students, they have these IEPs for a reason, and you want to uphold them. And so not all IEPs are bad. Some IEPs are really good and beneficial, and so you want to be making sure that you uphold them, and you can hold yourself accountable. Make sure that you're always doing this. And if you got this in front of you, you're going to know, well, I got to make sure I do this, right? And also just, creating a log like this, something that just looks as, nice and simple as this, right? It can really help you remember what these accommodations are, because sometimes you have a lot of them. And so make sure you're providing all of them. You don't forget any of them. They're right in front of you with a sheet like this. And it just makes things a little bit easier. And so an IEP accommodation log, I would recommend everybody use one of these or make one for yourself. Anyways, special education and case law, that is the end of the lecture. Really, it's a difficult topic. It's very controversial. I even hate talking about it sometimes, right? Because you never know how people are going to take it. And there are controversies in this, though, so you have to mention them. And whether you fall on one side or the other, that all IEPs are good, or all IEPs are bad, or you're somewhere in the middle where you think all IEPs are one way or the other, or it's just half and half, or 90-10, whatever that may be, or how they're upheld for that matter too. So like are IEPs being upheld properly? Is the least restrictive environment being properly upheld? Because if it's not, that means students aren't getting the proper education that they need. It's supposed to be the least restrictive environment. You know, it's not to say that you should always throw kids in the general classroom. The least restrictive environment is different for different people. And so, you know, you should take that into consideration. If one IEP student might work to keep them in the general class, and other ones might not work. And oftentimes, schools don't even want to deal with it nowadays, and it's sickening because that means students aren't getting the services and accommodations that they need in order to be successful. So anyways, that's special education law, case law, education law in general, some federal law. And well, really that's the end of the lecture, I suppose. If you guys have any questions, be sure to leave them down in the comments below. If I got any of this wrong, you got a nice, interesting viewpoint, please be sure to just leave your opinion. Tell me. And I'm always ready to learn, especially on this stuff, right? This stuff is very difficult to understand. And I always try my best, but I never feel fully prepared to discuss it because it's just always so, it's a complicated topic, you know, and it's interesting, but it's complicated. And so yeah, do feel free to leave that down in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe, that would be awesome. And thank you very much. We'll see you guys for 2 more lectures on lesson planning and student teaching and the job market. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.